My name is John, and I've always loved taking my family on little adventures. Living in the city can feel overwhelming, and we often find ourselves longing for a quiet escape. One summer, I rented an old farmhouse on Airbnb. The listing made it look like the perfect getaway. Charming and rustic, with a big yard, a pool, and plenty of space for the kids to run around. It seemed like an ideal spot for a peaceful weekend. We arrived on a warm Friday afternoon. My wife, Julian, and our two kids, Liam and Zoe, were brimming with excitement. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by dense trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Its wide front porch, with creaky wooden steps and rocking chairs, gave the house an old-fashioned charm. Inside, the place felt like a time capsule, filled with antique furniture, faded photographs, and vintage knickknacks. It was cozy, but there was an unmistakable sense of history in every corner. After unpacking, we decided to spend the evening by the pool. The kids splashed and laughed as Julian and I sat at the edge, our feet dangling in the cool water. The fresh air, the soft rustle of the trees, and the golden glow of the setting sun made everything feel serene. As twilight deepened, we switched on the pool lights and had dinner outside under a canopy of stars. It felt perfect, almost too good to be true. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. It came from somewhere just beyond the reach of the pool's lights. I froze, straining my ears. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound came again, this time closer. I glanced at Julian, who noticed the change in my expression. "Did you hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice calm for the kids' sake. "It's probably just a deer or something," she replied, though her tone betrayed her own unease. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like someone walking through the trees toward us. My gut told me something wasn't right. I quickly told the kids to get out of the pool. They protested, but Julian and I hurriedly gathered our things and ushered everyone inside. Once we were in, I locked the door and checked every window to make sure they were secure. The house, which had felt warm and inviting earlier, now seemed full of shadows. After putting the kids to bed, I stayed in the living room, keeping a flashlight and my phone within arm's reach. The hours dragged by, and the house remained silent. Just as I began to convince myself that we'd overreacted, there was a loud knock on the front door. My heart jumped into my throat. Gripping the flashlight, I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood outside, dressed in a police uniform. His face was shadowed, but I could see the gleam of his badge under the porch light. "Open up. It's the police," he called out, his voice calm and authoritative. Something didn't sit right. Why would a police officer be here in the middle of the night? I decided not to open the door. Instead, I spoke through it. "Why are you here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been a report of suspicious activity in the area," he said. "Open the door so we can make sure everything's okay." His response sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical. My unease grew. I grabbed my phone and called the local police station to verify. As the phone rang, the man outside knocked harder. "Open the door now," he shouted, his tone shifting from calm to aggressive. The dispatcher finally answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They told me no officers had been sent to our location and advised me to stay inside and lock everything. They promised to send real officers immediately. My stomach sank as I realized the man outside was an imposter. I motioned for Julian to take the kids and hide in one of the bedrooms. Meanwhile, the fake officer tried the door handle, rattling it violently. My hands were shaking as I turned off all the lights and peeked through the curtains. That's when I saw them. Several figures moving around outside, their shadows flitting between the trees. The man at the door kept yelling, demanding we let him in. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as we waited for help. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car winding down the gravel road. The figures outside scattered, disappearing into the woods. When the real officers arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of the imposters. They told us it wasn't common, but occasionally, people posed as police officers to gain entry into homes, often with bad intentions. They advised us to leave for the night, just to be safe. Shaken but grateful, we quickly packed our things and headed to a nearby hotel. The kids were scared, and Julian and I couldn't stop replaying what had happened. As I drove, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to making a terrible mistake. What if I had opened the door? The next morning, we tried to process everything. The real officers assured us they'd keep investigating, but we never heard back about who those people were or what they wanted. The farmhouse, once so peaceful and charming, was now a place I couldn't bring myself to think about without a shiver of fear. That night changed everything for me. It taught me to always trust my instincts and to be cautious, especially in unfamiliar places. What started as a simple family getaway turned into a harrowing experience we'll never forget. While I'm grateful we were unharmed, the memory of that night serves as a constant reminder of how quickly a peaceful moment can turn into something far more sinister. My name is John, and I live in a quiet little town where everyone knows everyone else. It's the kind of place where life moves at a slower pace, and neighbors stop to chat on the way to the market. One of my favorite things to do is host dinner parties. There's something special about gathering friends around a table filled with good food and lively conversation. One warm summer evening, I planned another dinner party for my closest friends. I had no idea that night would unravel into a mystery that still lingers in my mind. I spent the entire day preparing for the event, carefully arranging the table with my best dishes and filling the house with the comforting aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the windows, my friends began to arrive. Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and another friend, also named John, were there, along with someone new, Thomas, a recent arrival to our town. Thomas was a bit of an enigma. He was quiet, reserved, and seemed to prefer keeping to himself. I thought it would be kind to invite him, hoping he might enjoy the company and start to feel at home. He seemed grateful for the invitation, and I was eager for him to feel included. The evening began just as I had hoped. Laughter filled the room as we shared stories and savored the food. It felt like one of those perfect nights where everything was in harmony. After dessert, we moved to the living room to continue chatting. Thomas, however, seemed unusually withdrawn. He didn't say much, and while I noticed his silence, I chalked it up to nerves or unfamiliarity with the group. But as the night wore on, his behavior shifted. His posture stiffened, his face tightened, and he barely made eye contact. Then, without warning, he stood up abruptly, muttered something about needing to leave, and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. The room fell silent, all of us stunned. We exchanged puzzled looks, unsure of what had just happened. After a moment, we tried to move past it, though the atmosphere had undeniably changed. Eventually, the evening came to a close, and my friends left, still murmuring about Thomas's strange exit. The next morning, an uneasy feeling lingered. Something about Thomas's sudden departure didn't sit right with me. I decided to stop by his house to check on him. His car was parked in the driveway, but when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I waited a while, assuming he might need some space. Days passed, and still, there was no word from him. I reached out to my friends, but none of them had seen or heard from him either. My concern grew until I finally contacted the police and reported him missing. The police took my statement and assured me they would look into it. Weeks turned into months, and despite their efforts, searching his home, questioning neighbors, and following leads, Thomas seemed to have vanished without a trace. My friends and I were left with nothing but questions. I couldn't stop replaying that night in my mind, trying to pinpoint if there had been any sign, any clue, that could explain his sudden departure. Determined to find answers, I began looking into Thomas's past. I discovered he had moved to our town after a rough breakup, hoping for a fresh start. He didn't have many friends, and his family lived far away. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I truly knew about him. Then, one night, as I sat alone in my home, I heard a strange noise outside my window, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. My heart raced as I peered into the darkness, but I saw nothing. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was probably just an animal. But the strange noises didn't stop. Over the following nights, I heard footsteps, faint whispers, and had the unnerving feeling that I was being watched. Sleep became difficult, and a constant tension hung over me. During a visit to Thomas's house, I stumbled upon something the police had missed, an old journal. Its pages were filled with his deeply troubled thoughts. He wrote about feeling lost, both in the town and in his own life. His entries became darker, tinged with paranoia and fear. The final entry was dated the night of the dinner party. I can't escape it. It's always watching, always waiting. I need to leave before it's too late. Those words sent a chill through me. What had Thomas been so afraid of? I handed the journal over to the police, but it provided no concrete answers. Their investigation eventually went cold, and life in our small town moved on. But for me, the mystery of that night never faded. Couldn't let it go. Late at night, I would sit in silence, staring into the darkness, straining to hear those faint noises, wondering if Thomas was out there somewhere. Lost, scared, or worse. My friends tried to reassure me, but their words couldn't erase the shadow of that night. The dinner party, once a joyful memory, had turned into an unresolved enigma that weighed on my mind. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think about Thomas and all the unanswered questions he left behind. It feels as though his story clings to me like a ghost that refuses to rest. And so, I continue to search for answers, holding on to the faint hope that one day, the mystery will finally be solved, and Thomas's story will have an ending. Last September, my friends and I decided to take a night drive. We were all bored and craving a bit of adventure to spice up the quiet evening. It was a crisp, cold night with a sky so clear you could see the stars twinkling against the inky darkness. The moon hung bright and full, casting an otherworldly glow over the empty roads. There were 4 of us in the car: me, David, Sam, and Jenny. As we drove aimlessly, the car was filled with laughter and music until someone brought up the topic of ghost stories. That's when Sam mentioned an old, abandoned house at the edge of town. "We should check it out," he suggested with a mischievous grin. The idea sent a mix of excitement and nervousness through the group, but we all agreed. Without hesitation, David, who was driving, turned the car in the direction of the house. The road grew narrower and rougher as we went further out of town. The tall trees lining the path seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches twisting in the moonlight like skeletal hands. When the house finally came into view, it looked exactly like something out of a horror movie. It stood alone at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown bushes and tangled grass. The structure was massive, with broken windows that glinted in the moonlight and a sagging roof that seemed on the verge of collapse. It was clear the house had been abandoned for years, and the car's headlights only made it appear more sinister, casting eerie shadows that danced across the crumbling walls. We parked a little way down the road, not wanting to draw too much attention, and approached the house on foot. The closer we got, the colder the air felt, and the crunch of gravel under our shoes was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. My heart was pounding, and I could sense my friends were just as on edge. When we reached the front door, it hung ajar on its rusted hinges. David gave it a gentle push, and it creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was heavy and smelled of mold and decay. Moonlight streamed through the shattered windows, creating sharp shadows on the dusty wooden floors. The only sounds were the occasional groan of the old house settling and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our steps. We decided to split up to explore the house. Jenny and I headed upstairs, while David and Sam stayed on the ground floor. Each step on the rickety staircase echoed like a warning, but we pressed on. The second floor was filled with forgotten relics of the past. Furniture draped in tattered white sheets, broken picture frames, and cobwebs hanging in every corner. It felt as though the house had been frozen in time, holding its breath. Jenny and I wandered from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the dense darkness. In one room, I found an old, dusty diary lying on a table, When I opened it, the pages were too faded to read. Just as I was about to put it down, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. "David? Sam?" Jenny called out, but there was no response. We hurried down the stairs, our flashlights bobbing wildly. The living room was empty, but strangely, the front door, which we had left open, was now closed. A creeping sense of unease settled over me. Something didn't feel right. "We need to find them and get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. We searched the ground floor, moving cautiously through each room. The kitchen and dining room were empty, and the house seemed unnervingly still. Finally, we found David and Sam in a small storage room at the back of the house. They were both standing silently, staring at something on the floor. When I followed their gaze, I saw it. A trapdoor, slightly ajar. "Did you open it?" I asked. Sam shook his head. "No, it was already open when we got here." A cold draft wafted up from the darkness below, sending chills down my spine. Despite every instinct telling us to leave, curiosity won out. We decided to check it out. The wooden ladder leading down groaned under our weight as we descended one by one into the basement. It was damp and freezing down there, with shelves of dusty jars and rusted tools lining the walls. In one corner of the room, we noticed a faint, flickering light. Cautiously, we approached it. It was an old oil lantern hanging from a nail in the wall, its dim flame barely illuminating the space around it. Just as we were examining the lantern, we heard footsteps above us. My blood ran cold. Someone else was in the house. We quickly turned off our flashlights and stood frozen, listening. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward the trapdoor. They stopped right above us. Then, with agonizing slowness, the trapdoor began to creak open. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted in the faint light from the living room. It was a man, tall, thin, with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dark. He began climbing down the ladder, his movements deliberate and slow. He muttered to himself words we couldn't make out. Panic surged through me as we backed into the shadows, desperately trying to stay out of his sight. My friends were trembling beside me, and I knew we had to get out, but the only exit was past him. Suddenly, he stopped, turning his head as though he had sensed us. His eyes locked onto mine, and a chilling smile spread across his face. Without thinking, we bolted for the ladder. David climbed first, followed by Jenny, then me. As Sam was climbing, the man grabbed his ankle, yanking him back down. Sam kicked and thrashed, and we all grabbed hold of him, pulling with everything we had. Finally, Sam broke free and we slammed the trapdoor shut, locking it with a rusted bolt. We didn't stop running until we were outside. Jumping into the car, David started the engine, and we sped away, tires screeching against the gravel. None of us looked back. The house vanished into the darkness behind us, but its shadow lingered in our minds. That night, what had started as an innocent search for adventure turned into a nightmare we would never forget. To this day, we don't talk about what happened in that house. But every time I pass the edge of town, a chill runs down my spine, and I press the gas pedal a little harder, desperate to leave that memory behind. In 2016, I had an experience so unsettling that it still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a Saturday night, and after a grueling work week, I was completely drained. Hoping to catch up on some rest, I decided to go to bed early. My small apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into bed, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't peaceful. My dreams were vivid, bizarre, chaotic images that made me feel trapped, as though I couldn't wake up no matter how hard I tried. When I finally snapped awake, it was still dark. Disoriented, I reached for my phone on the nightstand to check the time. 3:33 a.m. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of those strange dreams. That's when I noticed it. My heart stopped. There was another bed in my room. I stared in disbelief. It was identical to mine, White sheets, dark wooden frame, but I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom unit with no room for a second bed. Yet there it was right next to mine. I blinked several times, hoping I was imagining it, but it didn't go away. What made it even more horrifying was the figure lying in it. The sheet was pulled up over their head, concealing their face, but the unmistakable outline of a body was there. My breath caught in my throat. Who could it be? No one else had a key to my apartment. I hadn't invited anyone over. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stared at the motionless figure. My instincts screamed at me to do something, but my body felt paralyzed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced through my options. Should I call the police? Should I run? Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the door. My shaking hand reached for the light switch, fumbling to find it. When I finally flipped it on, the room flooded with light, but the figure under the sheet didn't move. The bed was clearer now, illuminated in the harsh light. The sheets looked old and slightly stained, as though they hadn't been washed in years. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I forced my trembling legs to carry me closer. My eyes stayed locked on the figure. As I approached, I noticed the sheet was thin, nearly translucent, and I could make out the vague shape of the person's body beneath it. But their face remained hidden. My hands shook as I reached out, my fingers barely grazing the edge of the sheet. The moment I touched it, the figure moved. I jumped back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The figure sat up slowly, the sheet still draped over them. They turned their head toward me, and even though I couldn't see their face, I felt their gaze. Intense, unrelenting, and ice-cold. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place by sheer terror. The figure stood, towering over me. They were taller than anyone I knew, their movements slow and deliberate. My voice finally returned, though it was barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. They just stood there, silent and still, as though they were waiting for something. My fear reached a breaking point. I turned and bolted for the door, my hands fumbling with the lock as I heard their deliberate footsteps behind me. Finally, I yanked the door open and sprinted into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing with questions. Who or what had been in my room? How had they gotten in? I knew I couldn't go back inside alone. Trembling, I called the police. When the officers arrived, I explained everything in a rush. They exchanged uneasy glances but reassured me they would check the apartment. I stood outside, pacing back and forth, the adrenaline still coursing through me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for them to return. Finally, the door opened, and one of the officers stepped out. "There's no one inside," he said calmly. "We searched the entire apartment. Everything looks normal. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" I knew what I had seen, but I didn't argue. Thanking them, I watched as they drove away, leaving me alone in the stillness of the night. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I went back inside. The second bed was gone. The room looked exactly as it had before I went to sleep. I checked every door and window, but everything was locked tight. A deep chill settled over me as I realized there was no trace of the figure or the bed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment on, jumping at the smallest sound. The experience left me shaken in a way I couldn't explain. A few weeks later, I moved to a new apartment, hoping to leave the memory behind. But even now, years later, the fear hasn't entirely faded. Sometimes, late at night, I feel an unshakable sense of being watched. And every so often, I catch myself wondering if the figure in the sheet will ever return. I worked the night shift at a quiet gas station in New Hampshire. My responsibilities were straightforward: stocking shelves, cleaning up, and manning the register. Most nights were uneventful, with only the occasional customer stopping by to fuel up or grab a snack. But one night, as I was wrapping up my shift, something felt off. The air around me seemed unnaturally still, as if the world had hit pause. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, an old car pulled into the lot. The engine sputtered to a stop, and out stepped an elderly man. He wore neatly pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, his white hair combed carefully into place. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. As he walked into the store, I greeted him with my usual cheer. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" I asked, smiling politely. The man didn't respond, just nodded and began wandering through the aisles, scanning the shelves with an almost eerie calm. I went back to wiping down the counter and organizing the magazines, keeping one eye on him as he moved about. A few minutes later, he approached the counter, placing a small bottle of water and a pack of gum on it. "Is that everything?" I asked as I rang him up. He nodded again, but this time his gaze met mine, and it unsettled me. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite put my finger on, something cold and distant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. I handed him his change, but as I did, he suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist. His hand was ice cold, and I froze. "Hell is real," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "And the devil already has his hand on you. Be careful." The air around us seemed to thicken as his words sank in. I stared at him, unable to speak, my heart pounding in my chest. After a moment, he released my wrist, picked up his items, and walked out of the store without another word. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as his car disappeared into the night. A chill ran down my spine, and his warning echoed in my head. I tried to shake it off and finish my shift, but the uneasiness lingered. Every sound, every shadow, seemed amplified. I locked up the store and drove home, glancing repeatedly in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his car following me. The night felt darker than usual, and the familiar streets seemed foreign and menacing. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking them all before sitting on the couch. Couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building made my heart race, and the old man's words replayed in my mind, filling me with a deep, inexplicable dread. The next morning, I told my coworker about the encounter. He laughed it off, dismissing the old man as some harmless lunatic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. His words had felt heavy, deliberate, and the unease they left behind wouldn't fade. Over the next few weeks, life returned to normal, or at least it seemed to. But every time I worked the night shift, I felt a creeping sense of dread, like I was being watched. One particularly quiet night, while restocking the shelves, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, listening intently. It sounded distant, almost imperceptible. When I turned around, there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the store with an eerie, unintelligible murmur. My heart raced as I glanced around, but everything appeared normal. The fluorescent lights flickered for a moment, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Suddenly, I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Fear gripped me, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers intensified, filling my ears like a relentless tide. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and tried to call my coworker, but the call went unanswered. Panic surged through me as I glanced at the clock. It was just before midnight. The door chime rang, breaking the oppressive silence. I turned toward the entrance, and there he was, the old man. He stood motionless in the doorway, his piercing gaze locked onto mine. My stomach dropped as he slowly stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly against the tile floor. "Hell is real," he repeated, his voice as cold as the grave. "And the devil already has his hand on you. Be careful." He moved closer, reaching out to grab my wrist again. His touch sent a wave of icy dread through me, and I stumbled backward, pulling my hand away. His eyes seemed to burn into mine, his expression a mix of pity and menace. "Be careful," he whispered again before turning and walking out of the store, leaving the door ajar. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Finally, I bolted out of the store, jumped into my car, and drove home as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with fear. That night, I didn't sleep. The old man's words echoed in my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of doom. I called in sick the next day, too terrified to return to the gas station. I never saw the old man again, but his warning has stayed with me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something dark is lurking, just out of sight. Whether he was crazy or telling the truth, I'll never forget the fear he left behind, or the sense that his words were a warning I should never have ignored. A few years ago, my son David was brought home late one night by his best friend, James. At the time, David was 20 years old and had gone out with his usual group of friends. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the front door creak open. Instantly, I got up, worried about what might be happening. As I stepped into the living room, I saw James struggling to keep David upright. David was a mess, completely drunk, his clothes rumpled, and his eyes barely open. James, who was tall and athletic, held him up with little effort, his face calm and composed. "Sorry about this," James said with an apologetic tone. "David went a little overboard tonight." I didn't respond immediately, my concern for my son outweighing any annoyance I might have felt. "Let's get him upstairs," I said finally, stepping forward to help. Together, we supported David up the stairs and into his room. He was muttering gibberish, his head drooping as we laid him on the bed. I removed his shoes and tucked him in, hoping that by morning, he'd be himself again. James lingered for a moment before stepping back toward the door. "Thanks for bringing him home," I said, relieved that he was safe. "Don't worry about it," James replied with a faint smile. "I'll check on him tomorrow." With that, he left and I returned to my room, grateful for James's help but still unsettled by the sight of my son in such a state. The next morning, David woke up groggy but unharmed. He barely remembered the night before, only that he'd gone out with his friends and had too much to drink. Life quickly returned to normal, and I put the incident out of my mind. But a year later, everything changed. One evening, while I was watching the news, a breaking story caught my attention. The reporter stood outside a hotel, describing a gruesome crime. My stomach sank as I listened. A young man was discovered dead in a hotel room earlier today. The reporter began. The victim, whose identity has not yet been released, was allegedly brought to the hotel by a friend the previous night. Police are now searching for this friend, who is considered a prime suspect. A cold wave of dread swept over me. Something about the story felt eerily familiar. My eyes stayed glued to the screen as the reporter continued. Witnesses describe seeing the suspect leave the hotel early this morning. Police have released a composite sketch of the individual. When the sketch appeared, my heart stopped. The face on the screen looked just like James. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Could it really be him? The thought was unbearable. Without hesitation, I called David. It took a few rings before he answered, his voice groggy. "David, turn on the news," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to see this." A few minutes later, he called me back, his tone now sharp with disbelief. "What do we do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my thoughts spinning. "We have to call the police." We did, and detectives arrived at our house later that night to ask questions about James. David recounted everything he knew about him, including the night James had brought him home drunk. The detectives listened intently, their faces grave as they took notes. Days turned into weeks, and the search for James dominated the news. Our small town buzzed with rumors, each one more unsettling than the last. As more details emerged, the horror deepened. James hadn't just brought his friend to the hotel. He had killed him and fled. The brutality of the act was almost impossible to comprehend. David was devastated. He couldn't reconcile the image of the friend he had trusted for years with the man being described in the news. He withdrew from everyone, spending most of his time in his room. I tried to comfort him, but there was little I could do to ease his anguish. One quiet evening, as we sat in the living room, David broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice low and heavy, "do you think I could have been next?" The question hung in the air, chilling and unanswerable. The same thought had crossed my mind, but I'd pushed it away, too afraid to confront it. "I don't know," I said softly, my throat tight, "but you're here and you're safe now. That's what matters." Eventually, James was caught. He'd fled to a neighboring state and was hiding in a rundown motel when the police found him. His arrest brought some relief, but the emotional scars he left behind were deep. The trial was long and harrowing, revealing details of the crime that were almost too much to bear. In the end, James was sentenced to life in prison. But for David and me, the damage had already been done. The fear and betrayal lingered, casting a shadow over our lives. David struggled to move forward, haunted by the knowledge that someone he had trusted could commit such a horrific act. Though he has worked hard to rebuild his life, I still see flashes of pain in his eyes, a reminder of the nightmare we lived through. That experience taught us a hard lesson about trust and the darkness that can hide in people we think we know. We still talk about that night sometimes, the night James brought David home. It's a painful memory, but one that serves as a reminder of how close we came to losing everything. And even though we've tried to move on, the echoes of that time will always stay with us. When I was younger, I had an obsession with exploring abandoned places. There was something about the mystery of old, forgotten buildings that called to me. The idea that these places were once bustling with life but now stood eerily silent fascinated me. I loved walking through the remnants of the past, seeing the decay of things that were once vibrant, and imagining the stories the walls could tell. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned school in our town. The building had been empty for decades, surrounded by chilling rumors. Some claimed it was haunted, and we wanted to see for ourselves if there was any truth to the tales. It was a perfect night for an adventure. Cool, dark, and quiet. We met at my house, armed with flashlights, snacks, and our phones. There were 4 of us: Thomas, Lisa, Sarah, and me. The walk to the school was filled with nervous excitement. As we approached, we traded the creepy stories we'd heard about the place. People claimed they'd heard unexplainable noises coming from inside, while others swore they'd seen shadows moving in the windows late at night. When we finally reached the school, it was more intimidating than we had expected. The windows were shattered, and the front doors were boarded up. Thick vines crawled up the cracked walls, and the paint had peeled away in jagged strips, revealing the weathered brick underneath. It looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie. We circled the building and found an entry point, a broken window at the back. One by one, we climbed through, doing our best to stay quiet. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating dusty hallways lined with rusted lockers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of our footsteps on the cracked tile floor. We decided to stick together, not wanting to risk getting lost in the labyrinth of corridors. We started in the main hallway, where the principal's office was located. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers were scattered across the floor, the desk was overturned, and the filing cabinets hung open. It looked as though someone had left in a panic. A chill ran down my spine as I wondered what could have caused such chaos. From there, we moved on to the classrooms. Desks and chairs were overturned or stacked haphazardly, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Books were left open on some desks, their yellowed pages curling with age. It was as if the students had vanished suddenly, leaving their belongings behind. In one room, we found a chalkboard with strange markings on it. The words were smeared and almost illegible, but they seemed to spell out a warning. Thomas, always the skeptic, dismissed it as a prank left by other explorers. but something about it unsettled me, the ominous message clinging to the edges of my mind. As we ventured deeper into the building, a loud noise shattered the stillness. It sounded like something heavy falling in the distance. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity, or maybe adrenaline, kept us moving forward. We followed the sound down a dimly lit hallway lined with faded photographs of students and teachers. The smiles in those old pictures felt unnerving in the flickering light, as though the eyes were following us. At the end of the hallway, we came to the doors of the gymnasium. The noises were coming from inside. Thomas hesitated for a moment before pushing the doors open. The gym was vast, and our flashlights barely illuminated the far corners. The air was thick, and every creak of the wooden floor echoed ominously. Then we saw it. In the center of the gym stood a figure, its back turned to us. It was dressed in tattered clothes, its hunched shoulders rising and falling as if it were breathing heavily. We froze, paralyzed by fear. The figure began to move, slowly turning to face us. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to stare straight through us. Then it let out a piercing scream, a sound so unnatural and bone-chilling that it jolted us into action. We ran. I don't remember how we found our way back through the building or how we managed to climb out of the window. All I remember is the sheer, unrelenting terror that propelled us forward. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the school, our lungs burning and our clothes drenched in sweat. We never spoke of what we saw in detail, and we never returned to that school. The experience lingered, haunting us for months. My once persistent curiosity about abandoned places vanished, replaced by a deep unease. What we encountered that night remains a mystery, and I'm content to leave it that way. The school still stands, slowly crumbling under the weight of time. It's a stark reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. I no longer seek out forgotten buildings, and I've traded the thrill of exploration for the comfort of safety. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes, the past isn't meant to be revisited, and the unknown is best left unexplored. I was working the night shift at a quiet gas station, and the night had been uneventful so far. The store was silent except for the low hum of the cooling system and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I was more than halfway through my shift, stocking shelves and tidying up, when the door chimes suddenly rang. A woman walked in holding the hand of a young boy. Both of them looked terrified. The woman's clothes were torn, her face streaked with tears, and her hands trembled. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, clung to her side, his wide eyes darting nervously around the store. My heart sank at the sight of them. She approached the counter, her voice shaky. "Can I use your phone?" Without hesitation, I nodded and handed her the store phone. As she dialed, I noticed her hands trembling so much that it was difficult for her to press the buttons. The boy stood close to her, clutching her arm and watching her every move. It was clear they had been through something horrible. The woman spoke softly into the phone, her words rushed and urgent. I tried not to listen, but I caught snippets of the conversation. She was pleading with someone for help, her tone laced with desperation. When she hung up, she looked at me, her eyes red and glassy. "Do you mind if we stay here for a little while?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," I said, nodding quickly. "Take all the time you need." I offered them some water and snacks, which they hesitantly accepted. The woman sat down with her son in the corner of the store, her shoulders hunched as she tried to comfort him. The boy nibbled on a candy bar, his gaze darting toward the door every few seconds, while the woman sipped the water, her hands still shaking. I stayed behind the counter, keeping an eye on them, unsure of what they were running from but certain it was something dangerous. About an hour later, the door chime rang again, this time louder, more forceful. A man stormed in, his face twisted with anger. He was tall and broad, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet store. "There you are," he barked, his eyes locking onto the woman and the boy. The woman shrank back instinctively, pulling her son closer to her. The boy's grip tightened around her arm, and his eyes filled with fear. "Sir, you need to leave," I said firmly, stepping out from behind the counter and positioning myself between him and them. "Get out of my way," the man roared, trying to push past me. "She's coming with me." The woman began to cry, clutching her son tightly, while the man grew more aggressive, shoving at me to reach them. My heart pounded in my chest, but I refused to move. "Sir, if you don't leave, I'm calling the police," I warned, grabbing the phone. "Go ahead," he snarled, slapping the phone out of my hand. It clattered to the floor, but I quickly retrieved it and managed to dial 911. "Help! We need police at the gas station on Elm Street," I shouted into the phone, my voice shaking. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. The man continued yelling and trying to grab the woman, who screamed and shielded her son. I kept blocking his path, my adrenaline surging as I tried to protect them. The boy's sobs filled the air, adding to the chaos. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car appeared through the store's windows. 2 officers burst through the door, guns drawn. "Step away from them," one of the officers commanded. The man froze, his fists clenched, before reluctantly raising his hands. His face was still contorted with rage, but he didn't resist as the officers moved in, handcuffing him and escorting him outside. The tension in the room broke as the door closed behind them. The woman collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief. The boy wrapped his arms around her neck, clinging to her like a lifeline. One of the officers stayed behind to talk to her, gently asking questions while the other dealt with the man outside. She explained that the man was her boyfriend and had been abusive for years. That night, she had finally found the courage to escape with her son, running to the gas station in desperation. The officer assured her that she was safe now and that they would help her find somewhere secure to stay. Hearing that gave me a deep sense of relief. I had felt powerless against the man's fury, but now I knew they were in good hands. Before leaving, the woman turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you so much." "You're welcome," I replied softly. "I'm just glad you're both safe." The officers helped them into a patrol car, where they would be taken to a safe house for the night. I watched as the car drove away, the boy resting his head on his mother's shoulder. The store fell silent again, but the night didn't feel the same. The hum of the cooling system and the buzz of the lights seemed louder now, echoing in the stillness. As the hours passed and the sun began to rise, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her son. I hoped they would find peace and safety and that their lives would finally take a turn for the better. That night, I learned how quickly life can turn terrifying and how important it is to stand up for those who need help. It was a shift I'd never forget, a moment that reminded me of the strength of kindness and the courage it takes to face fear.